Discussing the House right now. I don't know when we have this excitement right in our chamber, but I want to welcome everyone to this very important hearing, and I'm actually really excited to hear from our witnesses. I would like to thank Ranking Member Lee and his staff for working with us to plan this hearing. So everyone looks back fondly, maybe at the first place they ever lived. For me, in 1960, my parents wallpapered the last room in their house on a dirt road on 1315 Oakview Lane in Plymouth, Minnesota. I still remember that my whole time growing up, we lived in the same house, and it had exposed wood ceilings. It had no dishwasher to the end, but it had exposed wood ceilings, and my grandma, who grew up on the Iron Range of Minnesota, would come down to the cities to see the house, and she would every single time, my grandma Mary Klobuchar, say to my mom and dad, "When are you going to finish the ceiling?" The brightly colored appliances, butter yellow colored oven, that was all part of our lives. And my dad paid for that house with a GI loan. And today, I think we all know that houses are not available to many young families in the same way that my parents could afford them on a teacher's salary and a starting newspaper reporter's salary. In 1960, the median home value was $11,900. That is about $123,000 in today's dollars. And this was, of course, in the midst of the post-war housing boom. Today, the median single-family home costs more than $400,000 if you look at it across America. This is an increase of more than 500% since 1980 and more than 40% since 2020. I think we know why this is. Affordable options are too few. Freddie Mac estimates that we need to build 3.8 million new homes to make up for the housing deficit. And according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the affordable housing gap for those with low incomes is more than 7.3 million rental units. We know rents have always gone up, jumping more than 12% since August of 22 alone. And in some 20 million households, they spend more than half of their income on housing. So what do we do? The affordable housing crisis is a result of complex, long-standing issues, many of which are the focus of our colleagues over in the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, chaired by Senator Sharon Brown, and Tina Smith, my colleague, chairs the subcommittee. We know there's issues of workforce to build housing. There's issues of the costs of building housing and the component parts. But today we're going to focus on the role that competition policy changes to help address these market failures. So some of the issues I'll put on the table that are relevant to our committee. First, renters face real challenges to compare and contrast prices. More and more of the costs of renting are hidden from view through the proliferation of junk fees. As a result, renters struggle to take advantage of price competition because the true costs of housing are not transparent. Second, housing is an area in which we have seen the widespread use of algorithmic pricing tools designed to raise prices, even at the expense of higher vacancy rates. A growing number of companies like RealPage and Yardi offer services that collect competitively sensitive pricing information from competing property management committees, feed that data through sophisticated algorithms, and recommend unit-by-unit prices so landlords can charge a certain rent. Landlords have figured out that it is better for them and their bottom lines to use these products to price units high so that some of them actually sit empty, but it is easier to have them priced high for them in the long term. And so I believe landlords should be competing on price. And I don't think you see that happening when you have this algorithm-based games going on. Third, families are being boxed out of the market for single-family homes by institutional investors. I've been wide-range news reports about this, where institutional investors will just buy up homes in a neighborhood, making it out of reach, especially for first-time home buyers. The institutional buyers are often backed by large private equity funds, seeking reliable revenues through rental income instead of allowing families to achieve the dream of home ownership. The presence of these institutional actors drives up home prices because they can make all cash offers and waive inspections to outbid everyday people. And unlike mom and pop landlords, these absentee owners are more likely to charge junk fees, evict families, and increase instability in our communities. Finally, this is all made worse by the fact that we are not building enough affordable housing. The number of starter homes being built has plummeted since the 2008 financial crisis, which put hundreds of thousands of small builders out of business. This has left us reliant on fewer and fewer large company home builders that dominate home building in major metropolitan areas. The builders tend to focus on high-end homes rather than starter homes. The consolidation in the home building market has been shown to reduce the number of new homes built by more than 100,000 houses every single year. So while we recognize that competition policy is no silver bullet, and I will emphasize that as we talk about, I'm sure, some of the other issues at hand, while it is no silver bullet for solving our affordable housing crisis, we shouldn't dismiss its importance. We should at least explore it and look at what possible solutions we can agree on. The antitrust laws were actually used in the 1960s to make sure that there was fairness in sales of homes, and we now need to examine whether antitrust and consumer protection laws need to be updated to eliminate predatory junk fees from rental markets, root out anti-competitive tools that facilitate price fixing instead of competition, and ensure the market is more responsive to the increased demand for housing. I look forward to exploring these issues with my colleagues and our esteemed witnesses today. I now turn it over to Senator Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to all of you for coming. This is an important issue, and I'm glad we're holding the hearing. Millions of Americans all across the country, including so many in my own home state of Utah, are paying significantly higher prices to own, rent, or otherwise live in a home in 2023. Home ownership is even further out of reach for Americans than it has been at any other time in modern history. And this has created problems that we hope to address and discuss today. Just since July of 2021, just over 2 years ago, the affordability of a home has declined significantly, even in that narrow time frame. According to the Home Ownership Affordability Monitor, housing accounted for about 28% of Americans' median income in January of 2021. It's a lot of money. That's up then from what it had been just a few years earlier, when it used to be much lower than that. But, you know, it's a sizable chunk. People were spending over a quarter, between a quarter and a third of their income on housing. But let's look at what happened since then. It's jumped to a whopping 44% by September of 2023. These rates are worse than those seen during the financial crisis of 2008. Homes are less affordable today than at any other time since we started keeping track of this particular set of records back in 2006. We've never seen anything this bad since we began keeping those records. The monthly mortgage payment on a median price home has more than doubled in just 2 years. In 2021, it was $979, while today that payment is $2,059. It costs a family almost $13,000 more per year to live in the same house than it did just over 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, the moment our current president took office. And with rents at record highs, many Americans have limited housing options available to them. If Americans are spending 44% of their income, close to half of what they make, on housing and $13,000 more per year than they did just 2 years ago. It leaves families with less income, fewer resources, and less savings left over to pay for basic essentials, such as groceries, gasoline, cars, all of which have become dramatically more expensive at the exact same time that housing has become unaffordable. So with less ability to pay for these basic needs, there isn't money left over from anything else. Anything else, whether that's an emergency, unforeseen expense related to a car repair or a health condition, a family member who needs help, or a desire to go on a family vacation or buy something that the family needs. There isn't room for it because everything else has been taken up. And ultimately, the increased share of a family's income spent on housing may cause them to take on even more debt to make ends meet, and this in turn, over time, is going to lead to more bankruptcies. Many failures may contribute to the sudden, abrupt, and severe rise in housing costs. We've got a number of things that we could look at. The first one I want to mention involves state and local regulations, which account for a significant constraint on housing supply. Anytime we look at the price of a particular thing, whether it's a good or a service or something as basic as a home, you have to look at supply and demand and how those two are interacting. And these things, these regulations, impose significant constraints on housing supply at the same time when demand is hardly going away, and in many states like Utah, it's increasing rather abruptly and dramatically. In cities across America, residents are burdened with zoning and overburdensome land use regulations at the federal, state, and local levels. And these regulations decrease the housing supply and, in many cases, directly prohibit housing development, increase costs, create uncertainty, and they produce significant delays. For example, the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, originally adopted by the Obama administration, increased compliance costs and the cost of housing by adding additional federal zoning restrictions. Those restrictions aren't always things that show up as obviously the product of federal action, because they translate into these local units of government adopting new regulations, new restrictions in response to the AFFH rule, because they have to comply with those rules in order to continue receiving federal funds. For example, under the Community Development Block Grant Program. And it appears that the same will be true of the Biden administration's version of the same rule, which has not yet taken effect but will soon. Second, Americans are suffering through an extended period of high inflation generally, which has been particularly acute in the housing market. Throughout 2021, the inflation rate jumped to as high as 9%, more than 4 times the Federal Reserve's target inflation rate of 2%, in large part due to profligate federal spending and irresponsible monetary policy. Home prices rapidly increased over the last 5 decades, eclipsing the inflation rate by 150% since 1970. In fact, if home prices grew at the same rate as inflation since 1970, the median home price today would be just $177,788, rather than $408,100. Finally, the federal government's land ownership is also a critical factor, especially in parts of the United States that, like Utah, are home to vast swaths of federal land in holdings. In 2021, the states with the highest increases in home prices year over year were, not coincidentally, Arizona at 28.8%, Idaho at 28.7%, and Utah 24.5%. This comes as no surprise to us in the West. The federal government owns a really obscenely large percentage of our land. In Utah, the federal government owns about 67% of all the land in Utah. That's 2/3. Well, a small portion of this land consists of scenic national parks, Most federal land in the West is managed by the Bureau of Land Management or the U.S. Forest Service, and most of it doesn't look like the postcard-worthy picturesque viewscapes that you see associated with national parks. It's just land that the federal government owns, holds, refuses to sell, refuses to allow development on, and very often is used to lock people out of access to all kinds of things in the state, including, on occasion, their own property. Now, the United States now has a record shortage of over 5 million homes. In 2021, the states with the highest increases in home prices were located in the West. Unfortunately, finding available land to increase housing supply is a real struggle. I mean, it's very, very difficult, simply because it's not there, because we don't have very much of this rare commodity known as private land. And you have to have private land in order to build housing. So I've introduced a bill called the Houses Act, which would create a process by which local communities could nominate small tracts of run-of-the-mill BLM-managed land to be used to quickly address housing shortages and availability. And these are inholdings that are in or immediately outside of a city or town boundary, a place where people live. The Houses Act would help solve Utah's land and housing scarcity by allowing parcels of federal land to be purchased by a state or a unit of local government at a reduced price, giving them much-needed flexibility to address housing constraints. The act would require that land be subject to a density requirement and would protect against the development of expensive second homes purchased from the federal government on the parcels at issue. Now, in Utah, there are almost 23 million acres of federal land that happen to be managed by the Bureau of Land Management in the state, accounting for 43.24% of the total land in the state. Typical home prices in Utah have increased by 89% just over the last 5 years. 89% in 5 years. If just 1% of the acreage in Utah managed by the Bureau of Land Management in my state were made available for housing under the Houses Act, at least 774,000 additional homes could be built. We have large families in Utah and we reproduce rapidly, so we're going to need those homes. This hearing is intended to examine some of the factors contributing to the increased costs of homes, specifically some of the factors that members of the subcommittee might be able to help mitigate or potentially eliminate. And I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Very, very good. I know we've been joined by Senator Blumenthal, who got in at 3 a.m. from a trip to the Mideast, so a total devotion to our subcommittee, as well as Senator Hirono. I look forward to hearing from, given the loss of homes in the Maui fires, and I know she'll be focused on that. Thank you. We have with us our witnesses. Diane Yentel is the president and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. She's worked in affordable housing for over 25 years. Vanessa Calder is the Director of Opportunity and Family Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. She previously served as Executive Director and Staff Director at the Joint Economic Committee under Senator Lee. Luis Quintero is with us. He is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins Carey Business School with a PhD in economics from Carnegie Mellon University. His research focuses on real estate economics and housing affordability. E.J. Antoni is a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget. And Maurice Stucke is the Douglas A. Blaze Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Tennessee College of Law, where his teaching and research focuses on competition and antitrust law and policy. And he recently served as a senior advisor to the FTC and has spent years litigating antitrust matters with the Department of Justice. So with that, I'm going to swear in the witnesses. Here we go. If you guys could rise. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before the subcommittee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You can be seated. Now we will begin. So you can get started, Ms. Yentel. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, and Senator Hirono. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Across the nation, the lowest income renters face a severe shortage of affordable and available homes and a significant gap between incomes and housing costs. There is a national shortage of 7.3 million homes that are affordable and available to the lowest income renters. This shortage is a long-standing structural feature of the country's housing system, consistently impacting every state and nearly every community. For example, in both Chair Klobuchar's state of Minnesota and Ranking Member Lee's state of Utah, there are fewer than 4 affordable homes available for every 10 of the lowest income renter households. Without affordable housing options, more than 10 million of the lowest income renters, who are disproportionately people of color, pay at least half their limited income on rent, leaving them without the resources they need to put food on the table, purchase needed medications, or otherwise make ends meet, putting them one financial shock away from facing eviction and, in worst cases, homelessness. While wages have risen in recent years, these gains have not closed the persistent and significant gap between renters' incomes and the rising cost of rent. During the pandemic, policymakers responded to the growing threat of housing insecurity by providing unprecedented support to keep renters housed. These protections and resources cut evictions in half, lowered eviction filing rates to the lowest on record, and kept millions of people who otherwise would have lost their homes during the pandemic stably housed. But just as these emergency resources were depleted and pandemic-era renter protections expired, renters re-entered a housing market with skyrocketing rents and high costs elsewhere. The GAO has found that every $100 increase in median monthly rent is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness in that same community. Over 2021 and the first half of 2022, rents increased by about $200 a month. And as a result, eviction filing rates have now reached or surpassed pre-pandemic averages in many communities, resulting in increased homelessness. Even with the stabilization of rental prices this year, the rapid inflation we saw during 2021 and 2022 has done significant damage to affordability, especially for the lowest income renters. Median rent of new leases just last month were 24% higher than at the beginning of 2021. Rent increases are driven by several factors, including a growing demand for rental housing and limited supply. Rent increases can also be attributed to a mostly unregulated rental market with few tenant protections that, especially in markets where demand far outstrips supply, permits landlords to raise rents as high as the market will allow without regard to the impact on tenants with the lowest incomes. And in addition to high rent, landlords are increasingly imposing costly fees, further increasing costs for low-income renters. Renters, particularly those with the lowest incomes, have severely limited options in the housing market. The lack of national renter protections leaves tenants vulnerable to unjust treatment, housing instability, and evictions. Landlords can engage in abusive and predatory behavior with few consequences. Renters facing exorbitant rent increases or excessive fees have little to no ability to move to a new home. Instead, they can face retaliation for reporting unsafe housing conditions or illegal actions by landlords. And because so few renters have access to legal representation, many are unable to assert their legal rights. Strengthening and enforcing federal renter protections is a critically needed solution to America's housing crisis, along with eliminating restrictive local zoning laws to increase supply, increasing investments to make homes affordable to people with the lowest incomes through expansions of housing choice vouchers and the National Housing Trust Fund, and preventing evictions and homelessness with a National Housing Stabilization Fund. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Calder.
Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Vanessa Calder, and I am the Director of Opportunity and Family Policy Studies at Cato Institute. The views I express today are my own. They do not represent the official position of my employer. Accessible, low-cost housing is vital to the health and prosperity of America's families and communities. When housing is abundant, it is more affordable. Abundant housing provides educational and economic opportunities. It allows families to be part of the communities that they desire. Policies that support abundant, affordable housing are associated with reduced homelessness and better homeless policy outcomes. Although junk fees institutional investors in similar matters have received some recent attention, inaccessible high-cost housing is largely a result of existing federal, state, and local policy. Government policies that constrain housing development are particularly detrimental in this regard. State and local regulations constitute some of the most significant policies constraining housing supply. Zoning and land use regulations are nearly ubiquitous across American cities. These regulations directly prohibit housing development, increase costs, create uncertainty, and produce delays. Zoning regulations have a meaningful impact on family budgets. A well-known paper finds that zoning pushes up the cost of apartments by around 50% in Manhattan, San Francisco, and San Jose. A recent paper reviewing 24 metropolitan areas finds a massive zoning tax up to $500,000 per quarter acre in cities with restrictive land use regimes. In addition to state and local policy, federal policy also plays a role in limiting housing supply. In Western states, the federal government owns a substantial portion of the land which cannot be developed. In Nevada, Utah, and Idaho, the federal government owns between 60 and 80% of the land. In other Western states, the federal government owns more than a third to a half. Contrary to public perception, the vast majority of federal lands are not national parks, monuments, or Bureau of Indian Affairs land. Instead, most federal Western land is managed by the Bureau of Land Management or U.S. Forest Service. This land is often close to urban areas with a significant portion of land within city or county boundaries. Presented with a similar set of facts, in the 1990s, former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid led a group of legislators in passing the Southern Nevada Public Land Management Act. This legislation allowed local governments in the landlocked Las Vegas area to nominate federal land for competitive market auction. The sale of federal land in Clark County subsequently resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars allocated to Nevada public schools and environmental initiatives, creating a win-win for Nevada's developers, conservationists, and residents. Ranking Member Lee and co-sponsors of the Houses Act propose extending a similar solution to other Western states. The Houses Act would allow local governments to nominate and purchase federal land and develop the land for housing projects that meet certain density minimums and other criteria. Like the Southern Nevada Public Land Management Act, proceeds from the Houses Act would be made available for environmental initiatives. Research suggests that the Houses Act could have a meaningful impact on housing affordability. A recent U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee study finds that houses reforms could lead to the construction of almost 3 million homes, and this increase in housing development would be possible with the conversion of just 0.1% of existing federal land holdings. In addition to policies that directly constrain development, additional federal, state, and local policies are also relevant to housing affordability. When supply-limiting policies are addressed, the participation of investors in the housing market will be largely inconsequential. Furthermore, the gains that result from reforming supply-limiting policies exceed potential gains from regulating junk fees or market participants. When considering reforms to improve housing, policymakers and analysts should keep in mind that the government is the dominant regulator and player in the housing market. As a result, ample reform opportunities exist. Reforms that expand housing supply will unleash the housing market and ensure that American families have the choice, opportunity, and upward mobility that they desire. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Professor.
Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing and for your attention to the topic of competition and consumer rights in housing markets, an issue of critical national importance. My name is Luis Quintero. I'm an economist and have spent 8 years at Johns Hopkins where I do research on housing markets and policy. In my work, I have documented the increasing consolidation of housing markets in the United States and its detrimental effects on housing affordability. And I am pleased that this Congress is taking a proactive step to incorporate competition in the legislative discussion. Concentration in housing markets has been growing since the Great Recession. This trend follows the long-term decline in competition documented in so many other sectors of the U.S. economy. Although market consolidation is not the only factor driving the housing affordability problem, it is a critical one. During the Great Recession, many local and regional home builders stopped operations, leaving large national builders dominant in many local markets. Furthermore, many of these large home builders have since merged. My work identifies at least 12 mergers that significantly increased the market share for the resulting firms. One of those cases formed the largest home building company in the country. Although national home prices have recovered since 2011, the number of building firms has not. While prices are up by about 30% with respect to their peak of 2008, the number of for-sale builders is down 80%. The competitive market forces that incentivize entry when prices increase are not being realized in American housing markets. I estimated that 56% of markets exhibit concentrations that would fall into the category of highly concentrated as defined by the FTC. Most of the gains in market shares in recent years come from the increase in the activity of two home builders. Large mergers in this sector have most likely not been challenged because regulating authorities may not be defining relevant housing markets narrowly enough. The whole country is not a single housing market. For example, home building in Pittsburgh or Cleveland is not a threat to the ability of a hypothetical monopolist to impose a significant and non-transitory increase in price in Philadelphia. Accordingly, housing markets must be correctly spatially defined to ensure estimated market shares are useful in assessing concentration. We should care about market consolidation because it affects housing supply and affordability. My estimates predict that if we had kept the 2006 levels of competition, the U.S. would have built 112 billion more last year, equivalent to approximately 160,000 units, additional units. This roughly equals to 10% of the private residential fixed investment predicted for 2023. We should encourage agencies to enforce competitive policy in housing markets more effectively and ask housing policies to incorporate market structure considerations. I would like to offer 6 recommendations for this committee's consideration. First, encourage regulatory agencies to carefully define local housing markets spatially when revising mergers. 2, consider legislation that shifts the burden of proof to home building companies in large-scale mergers, asking them to show they cannot exert monopoly power in any local relevant market where they have building activity. 3, encourage enforcement agencies to request mandatory divestitures in markets where a merger will cause high concentration. 4, encourage the federal government to make increasing competition a pillar of housing policies, for example, by requiring a minimum number of home builders participating in areas that get low-income housing tax credits. 5, encourage the same for statewide policies. Recent initiatives to relax restrictive zoning may be ineffective if local developers can just withhold production by exercising monopoly power. And 6, when considering the Philadelphia National Bank presumption, make sure market shares are defined using relevant spatial definitions of local housing markets. Thank you, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very, very much. Mr. Antoni.
Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, member of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to discuss with you today the current state of competition in the housing market and the impact public policy has had on the American consumer. I'm a public finance economist at the Heritage Foundation, where I research fiscal and monetary policy. I'm also a senior fellow at the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. Americans today are facing historic challenges to achieving the American dream of home ownership, a dream which might now be better described as a nightmare. Home ownership affordability is arguably at a record low today, with 43.8% of the median household before tax income needed to purchase the median price home. In several major metropolitan areas of the country, over 100% of the median household after tax income is needed to purchase the median price home. A recent report showed that a median price home is unaffordable for the average income earner in 99% of the 572 counties examined. Another report indicates that a potential home buyer needs an annual income over 50% higher than the median household income to afford a median price home, which is a record high. While recent data shows that homeownership is 70% more expensive today than renting, the largest spread in 23 years, rent prices are also at record highs, according to a variety of data, including figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The unaffordability of housing today has largely been caused by public policy. By manipulating interest rates to facilitate spending and borrowing by the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve created disruptions in the economy. The unprecedented size of fiscal and monetary interventions in the last 3 years made the magnitude of these disruptions historic. The creation of trillions of dollars predictably spawned 40-year high inflation, which caused prices everywhere to rise. Low interest rates also made increasingly larger mortgages affordable, which drove home prices to new highs. Because interest rates were held so much lower than their natural equilibrium, investments which would not ordinarily be profitable suddenly became so. Institutional investors were able to buy swaths of housing for the purpose of renting. When the Federal Reserve belatedly raised interest rates to reduce the inflation it had helped cause, financing costs rose dramatically, especially for mortgages. Fixed interest rates on 30-year mortgage ago, and the monthly mortgage payment on a median price home has more than doubled since January 2021. While higher interest rates put downward pressure on home prices, that is being countered today by at least two factors. First, most existing homeowners cannot afford to sell their home because doing so would mean losing a mortgage with a rate of 2 to 3% in exchange for a new loan at 7 to 8%. That would drastically reduce the size of the loan, sometimes by half, that the borrower could afford on the new home. Thus, the supply of existing homes has been severely hamstrung, so much so that the price premium on new homes has been reduced almost to zero. Second, the price indexes faced by home builders are at or near record highs. Home builders, therefore, cannot afford to lower their prices. A new home at an affordable price for the median household would be priced below the home builder's profitability threshold, so those homes simply aren't being built. Thus, the supply of new homes has also been curtailed, putting additional upward pressure on prices even as interest rates continue rising. The unaffordability of home ownership has forced many Americans to rent, and that shift in demand, coupled with inflation, has increased the price of renting. While algorithmic pricing aids have come under scrutiny recently amid accusations of their role in higher rent prices, there is no empirical evidence that such tools have increased prices absent collusion among landlords, an act which is illegal whether algorithmic pricing aids are used or not. There is even reason to believe that algorithmic pricing aids reduce rents for the marginal renter. Additionally, while the purchase of homes by institutional investors have reduced the supply of homes for sale and increased home prices, it has also increased the supply of homes for rent and decreased rent prices. Unfortunately, public policy mistakes have created a situation wherein an entire generation of Americans may never be able to afford their own home. Persistent inflation has made it almost impossible for many Americans to ever afford a down payment large enough for the monthly payments on a mortgage to be affordable. The solution is a drastic reduction in the amount of money that the Federal Reserve creates and that the Congress spends. If there is an antitrust problem regarding housing, it is the monopoly control of the nation's money supply. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Antoni. Next up, Professor Stucke.
Thank you so much for inviting me to testify today. So what does antitrust have to do with the concerns in the housing market? Now, you already heard about mergers increasing concentration in the home building market, and another concern that my colleague here mentioned is algorithmic collusion. Many of the nation's larger property managers rely on pricing algorithms provided by RealPage and Yardi. Property managers using RealPage's algorithm, for example, saw their revenues increase on average 3 to 4%, while their occupancy rates declined from 97 to 95%. One economic study found the same thing in geographic markets where property managers increasingly relied on algorithms for their rent, namely higher rents, on average 3% higher, and lower occupancy rate than markets where pricing algorithms weren't prevalent after controlling for observable market characteristics and local market conditions. So after Heather Vogel's ProPublica article, there have been now over 20 antitrust lawsuits brought against RealPage and some of the nation's largest property developers. They're all in the Middle District of Tennessee. And all of the lawsuits allege that RealPage colluded with property developers to raise rents and reduce output. So one issue for you is, can the antitrust laws effectively punish and deter this alleged anti-competitive behavior? And the short answer is yes, if humans agreed among themselves to fix price and RealPage's pricing algorithm was then used to facilitate their collusion. But the antitrust law, as currently applied by the courts, cannot punish and deter this anti-competitive behavior in three scenarios. First is tacit algorithmic collusion. This is where the algorithms learn to tacitly collude without any agreement. Second is what is a hub and spoke algorithmic collusion scheme where rivals gradually drift to one algorithm without any agreement among the rim. And then third is what we call secondary tacit collusion, where rivals rely on several different hubs for their pricing, but those hubs then learn to tacitly collude. Now, the harm from these three scenarios is the same as if the executives were agreeing among themselves in a smoke-filled hotel room, namely higher prices and reduced output. But this is not just a U.S. problem. I mean, many jurisdictions recognize that it's hard to challenge this type of collusion under their current antitrust law. And it's not just simply an issue in housing markets. Two recent studies have found evidence of tacit algorithmic collusion in Germany's retail gas station market, as well as on BOL.com, the largest online shopping marketplace in the Netherlands and Belgium. So, as more companies adopt pricing algorithms, this can be at times pro-competitive, but it also can be anti-competitive and beyond the reach of the antitrust law. So, if I can impress upon you one thing today, it's this. AI will only compound the legislative deficit to date. These problems will not go away. And you need then to look at this holistically from three different approaches. First, Congress should endorse the FTC's use of its authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act to tackle algorithmic collusion, and in addition, consider displacing the unwieldy rule of reason standard with clearer legal presumptions concerning certain vertical restraints. Second, the primary weapon to deal with algorithmic collusion is merger review. And the good news is that Congress has already proposed some of the tools necessary, such as restoring the incipiency standard in the merger review. And to note, it would be the Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act, and then the Prohibiting Anti-Competitive Mergers Act of 2022. Finally, any comprehensive policy response must address not only algorithmic collusion, but also the other myriad risks involving AI, and this includes concerns over behavioral discrimination. So we need privacy legislation, where individuals without penalty can opt out of the collection of their data for behavioral advertising. They can opt out of having their data collected about them in order to profile them. They can opt out of personalized services, and then they can also decide the right to limit at the onset what personal data is collected about them and for what non-advertising purpose. And this is just necessary. I mean, we see that in Europe, they already have the DMA. They're taking these additional steps. We need to do something as well to address the risks of AI. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Music to my ears, Professor Stucke. And thank you for kind of looking at this in that larger context of some of the need for reform of our antitrust laws. So thank you, all of you. I'm going to give my first slotted time to Senator Hirono, who's been patiently waiting, and then we'll turn to Senator Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for having this hearing. There's no question that the cost of housing is an issue throughout our country, and I am very well aware of how critical that is in Hawaii. In July, Hawaii Governor Josh Green issued an emergency proclamation on Hawaii's housing crisis. And then, not a simple thing, by the way. The average single-family house on Oahu now costs over $1 million, and less than 1/3 of households can afford to buy a home. Another third cannot afford rent. In part because of these figures, Hawaii loses another resident every 36 minutes. Let that sink in. As of 2022, there are more Native Hawaiians living on the mainland than in Hawaii. All of that predates the fire that devastated Lahaina and destroyed 3,000 homes and apartments, many of which house working-class families. Why do I bring up these facts? Well, junk fees, investor-owned homes, and supply chain shortages aren't entirely responsible for this crisis, but in such a tight market, they have an outsized effect. For Professor Stucke, this is the Antitrust Subcommittee, so I'm interested to know what can we do with our antitrust laws. I believe you mentioned some changes we could make to the FTC's ability to go after algorithmic collusion, but perhaps some Sherman Act changes could also be helpful. Can you just talk a little bit more about some of the kinds of antitrust changes that you mentioned?
Sure, certainly. I outlined them at the end, and one thing is that, the concern about junk fees, you have to ask yourself, why isn't competition addressing this? In fact, why are firms increasingly competing to find better ways to manipulate consumers? And this might happen in markets that aren't monopolistic or aren't having just a few competitors. So one area for competition authorities is to understand when competition isn't working, what are the assumptions underlying competition, and what is happening that is preventing competition from being a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. So this happens not only with junk fees, it's also with drip pricing and the like. And the FTC can go after that as an unfair method of competition. They can provide the necessary guardrails. The other area is with respect to pricing algorithms. Your principal weapon is going to be mergers to prevent markets from becoming highly concentrated, that this algorithm can occur. But the problem is that courts have drifted away and view themselves basically as fortune tellers that have to predict what will happen after the merger and expect the agencies to prove higher prices post-merger. And as an enforcer yourself of antitrust laws, you know how difficult that could be.
So basically, while we can, I think, possibly clarify and strengthen some of the antitrust provisions, it seems to me the bottom line in our housing situation is demand. There is so much more demand than there is availability of affordable for purchase and rentals, and this is something that Ms. Yentel, you and I co-wrote an op-ed back in 2019 about the affordable housing crisis and my pathway bill. How would combating, getting back to junk fees and other predatory fees, be part of a comprehensive solution to our country's housing crisis?
Well, as you and I have talked about in the past and raised awareness around, when you're looking at the lowest income people who have maybe a combined household earnings of $25,000, or a senior or a person with a disability who's on an extremely limited fixed income of $15,000, they're already living doubled or tripled up. They're already paying 50, 60, 70% of their very limited income just to keep a roof over their heads.
So what
Any
can we do?
additional
We're running out of
expense.
time. We know what there's so many challenges, but what can we do from the congressional level to, one thing, we could fund some of the housing support.
Absolutely,
programs.
we have to build more housing that's affordable to the lowest income people. We have to make existing housing affordable to the people living in it with rental assistance. We need robust and enforced tenant protections. And when it comes to extra fees that landlords are paying, we need full transparency, and they need to be minimized to the number of fees that landlords can charge tenants, because every dollar adds up, and that's another bill that a tenant.
I think there's a
pay.
bill that puts the price at $25 more in these kinds of fees. There's a lot we can do. Thank you very much for all of your testimony. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rono. Senator Lee.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair. Ms. Calder, I'd like to start with you, if that's all right. In your experience, where have you seen the most acute impact of significant federal land ownership in housing prices? Where in the United States does that show up?
Well, your staff at the Joint Economic Committee actually put together a great report on this and went sort of state by state. And I think a couple of the states that stood out to me, California actually has a huge housing shortage. There are certainly Utah, Nevada, of course. Nevada is mostly federal land. And there are some others that are listed there as well, and you sort of go state by state on those. I think, broadly speaking, the federal lands issue is something that affects all Western states. So it's not a single state that is impacted to a much greater degree than the others, but all of them would benefit substantially from federal lands reform.
Right. And it's an interesting thing to study, because in any state, first of all, there is no comparable landowner to the United States in America, nowhere. Nobody could afford to own that much land. But even if there were, they couldn't exempt themselves from all economic forces, including property taxation. And it certainly wouldn't exceed a few percentage points. But from a competition policy standpoint, there would be concern if any one individual or corporation, nonprofit, NGO, whatever, owned more than, 5 or 10% of the land in a state. It'd be pretty concerning. And so it's not surprising that in a state like Utah, where 67% of the land, 2/3 of it is owned by one owner, that owner exempts itself from property taxation and all economic forces, that it's going to have a significant constraint on the availability of housing supply, especially in a rugged state where a lot of our land is mountainous, and you've got a limited number of places where people could live to begin with, but it's drastically more limited when most of the land that could be inhabited by humans is owned by the federal government. What do you think can be done to alleviate some of the problems created by this significant land ownership? It doesn't have to necessarily result in a housing shortage, does it?
Well, I think certainly, zoning reform is part of the answer, right? So you can get more units by reforming zoning at the local level. You can build two directions. You can build up and you can build out. And so I think both pieces are part of the equation when it comes to making improvements to housing affordability. And I certainly think that the houses reforms or something like unto it is part of the equation when it comes to improving housing supply in Western states.
Right. You mentioned in your testimony that it would require just 0.1% of federal land holdings in order to substantially increase the availability of housing in Western states. Even eliminating altogether what are known as the housing availability shortages in some states. Is it your impression that this 0.1% change in federal land holdings what would that do to the overall experience of federal lands? I mean, does that cause a meaningful change for these land management agencies and those who enjoy accessing those lands to affect 0.1% of the federal land holdings in those states?
Yeah, I think we need to think about what type of land, again, this is. And as I mentioned in my testimony, it's with the Houses Act anyways, it would be BLM land that's really impacted by this, that would be that would be nominated and then purchased and then developed into housing. So BLM land, for those that aren't familiar, historically it was land that homesteaders had passed over. It was land that other agencies, other federal agencies didn't want to manage. Oftentimes when we're thinking of sort of the desert or Intermountain West, what this ends up looking like is sagebrush and desert land. And so it's not the scenic vistas, it's not national parks, it's not Bureau of Indian Affairs land. So from that perspective, I don't think the public would probably notice very much. What I think the public would notice is the funding that is being transferred into improvements to national parks and other types of infrastructure that they're going to benefit directly from. And that's something that the Houses Act allows for.
And significant benefits that go along with cost of living improvements along with that. Mr. Antoni, what role has government spending and irresponsible monetary policy at the federal level played in the more than doubling of the cost of home ownership just in the last 2 years?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. It has been the main driver, and without that cause, we would not have had the effect that we currently have today, where home ownership is just grossly unaffordable for the vast majority of Americans. When the Federal Reserve set out to create the trillions of dollars that the Treasury Department needed to spend over the last several years, it created inflation, which caused the price of everything to rise, especially homes. But its low interest rate policy, essentially a 0% interest rate, compounded that because it made the monthly payment on a mortgage incredibly low. And so you could afford a much larger mortgage for the exact same payment relative to, let's say, a normal interest rate, or the interest rates that we had at the end of 2019 or even the first 2 months of 2020. And so if you take away that root cause, you essentially remove the first link in the chain that we have been dealing with and are still dealing with today in terms of the unaffordability of home ownership, which has also compounded the problems in renting, because the shift of demand as people move away from trying to buy a home to rent a home because home ownership is simply too unaffordable, they are now increasing the demand for rents, which is driving up the price of rental units. And so it is not simply a problem contained to home ownership, but it is housing in general.
In the distribution of the victims that are harmed by this is not exactly even across the economic spectrum. I mean, it is disproportionately affecting the middle class and low-income earners.
Oh,
right?
Certainly, Senator. And this is true for inflation generally, but specifically for housing, those who have the least are hurt the most by it, an extension of the Matthew principle, I suppose you could say. And so what we are seeing today is essentially an entire generation of Americans who, for the first time in recent history, may never be able to own their own home, because as they continue saving, the savings that they have are losing value every day in the bank from inflation while the price of homes go up. And so they need an ever-growing down payment in order to buy a home, and the down payment needs to be especially large so that they can afford the monthly payment at such high interest rates. And the problem is that in that rat race, essentially, they will never actually get to the point where they have enough money for that down payment. Because as you were saying earlier, they are constantly seeing their earnings decrease in terms of what they can buy. And so there is less left over at the end of every month after they have paid for all of their necessities, including their ever-increasing rents, to be able to save for that down payment.
Rich people made out pretty well in this. Rich people who wanted to buy up a lot of stuff, they made out really well. They just did so at the expense of the poor and middle class. And all of this, if I'm understanding you correctly, has to do with the manipulation of the interest rates by the Fed, in part, to a significant degree anyway, to help facilitate the financing of reckless federal spending by Congress. In other words, Congress doesn't want to exercise the discipline to spend no more than it takes in or anything close to it. It wants the praise of spending more money without having to do the hard work. And in order to finance all of that, there's pressure on the Federal Reserve to keep rates low. That makes it easier for Congress to avoid doing the difficult work. And it perversely helps rich people while hurting poor and middle-class Americans. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so, Senator, especially when you consider that those who were already homeowners, or those who in the initial stages of the pandemic, for example, were able to take advantage of these historically low mortgage rates, they were able to acquire that capital at relatively low prices before the inflation set in the months and years that followed. And so they were able, again, to acquire capital at a relatively low cost, and then to see the price of that capital appreciate noticeably in the months and years that followed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. I'll start with you, Ms. Yentel. Can you talk about the type of junk fees that renters are faced with? I don't think people are always, who don't rent anymore, maybe rented at some point, are not familiar with what's going on.
There can be a whole, thank you, Senator Klobuchar, there can be a whole host of fees added onto a renter's rent payment each month, ranging from first rental application fees to get into the apartment in the first place, and then fees related to late payments. Notices of late payments can have an extra fee. There's pet fees, there's fees for using a garage, or fees for an internet usage that's mandatory and somebody can't opt out of. There's been stories of these fees adding up to as much as $400 a month in addition to the rental payment, and sometimes they can be very egregious. We have a partner in Idaho who worked with a tenant whose son brought home from school one day a praying mantis in a jar, and that month they were charged a pet fee from the landlord. The good news was that that spurred a successful campaign for the state of Idaho now to have a law that requires full transparency up front about any fees that might be paid, and requires that they be made reasonable. But they really can be egregious, and they certainly add up.
Wow. Just remembering back, my mom was a second grade teacher, and sometimes these type of animals would get lost when they went home. They were usually found, like the rabbits and things. But anyway, that's incredible. But I do think it gives us a sense of that, and those of us who rent when we're here actually know some of this as well. Professor Stucke, just to go through this again, because I think it's a hard thing to get a grasp on. There have been numerous reports and lawsuits highlighting these price-setting tools that collect the pricing data, and as you rightly point out, there's no federal privacy law in place, which is a problem, to coordinate price increases among competing landlords. So they're able to get this data. And could you explain how these pricing tools could facilitate these higher prices? So they get the data and then it's shared, and how can that lead to these higher prices where you could see it as not a traditional way of fixing prices maybe, but a way of doing it in the modern digital age?
Okay, so I mean, there's several scenarios. One scenario is where every firm has their own pricing algorithm. So when you go to like Martha's Vineyard, one thing you're surprised by is the high price of gas. But what one study found is that when gasoline stations start having these pricing algorithms, the speed and the response can prevent any company from getting an advantage by discounting. So what happens then in these markets is that prices start then elevating up. So algorithms can help facilitate collusion in markets already susceptible to it, but it can also increase it. Another scenario, and this happened in Las Vegas, is where allegedly 90% of the hotels are all using one hub. And so no competitor is going to give commercially sensitive information to the hub if the hub can then use it to help the rivals. So there must be some understanding that they're going to share on a real-time basis commercially sensitive information with the hub so that it's going to benefit all of them.
Okay, so you rightfully noted some of the bills, some of them are my bills, that you could do generically to fix the antitrust laws, tweaks, things you could do, because it's very hard to bring any cases, including in tech and other things right now, where we've had no specific laws really passed except for Senator Lee's, which I'm the proud co-sponsor, bill on not changing venues, and then our bill to change the merger fees that Grassley and I had to get more money to the agencies. Could you talk specifically what you could do about this specifically to update our competition laws so that these tools, as they are called, or price-setting tools, as they can be used for, cannot be used to raise rent above what would occur in a competitive marketplace.
Right. I mean, I think there are several things that can be done. Number one is to restore the incipiency standard in antitrust, that courts are adrift. They used to interpret the antitrust laws with the aim that Congress had intended, right? Seller-Kefauver in 1950 enacted these amendments to the antitrust laws, and the Supreme Court construed the law as Congress intended. That's no longer the case. So one way would be to restore the incipiency standard, which your bill does. The second thing then would be a different standard than the rule of reason for information exchanges, just because the rule of reason is just amorphous and unwieldy. And then the third thing, and I think this is what, like John Stuart Mill said, what one of the good things that the government can do is collect a lot of information and then disseminate it. So one nice thing about your bill is improving the knowledge that we have about what antitrust policies work and not work. I mean, when I was at the DOJ, it was always surprising that we would allow these mergers to happen, and then we never followed up to see,
Years later.
to see if it was right. And so,
Ticketmaster, Live Nation. Anyway, and I'm sorry, my mind just went to something else. Keep going.
But I would think that's one of the most important aspects that we can have. And then we could learn more about what markets are susceptible to tacit collusion. Is there a specific threshold? Like one study found, once it went beyond 8 sellers, the use of pricing algorithms became quite vigorous. And so we just need to have a better understanding, and the United States can play an important role in that.
One of the most pressing issues is not enough affordable homes. We just talked about that, single-family starter homes, the like. Mr. Quintero, Dr. Quintero, could you explain how having fewer home builders in a market reduces the supply of new homes?
Thanks for the question, Chair Klobuchar. The underlying concern about competition in general is how fewer suppliers of any good or service are just going to supply less of it, and as a consequence, with a fixed demand, or in this case for housing with a growing demand, prices would go up. This is what has been happening in housing. We have fewer and fewer developers building, and it's in their own interest to charge higher prices. And that is not a new story. That's an old story. That's a story of housing markets. The problem is that as prices have gone up since 2011, we have not seen an entry of new developers that compete with those that are incumbent. And so what we find is that those that have an interest in supplying less to charge higher prices are not being threatened by competitors in many of the local markets.
And so do you think that's something antitrust enforcers should look at in the future when mergers are presented to them?
Yes, there's been at least 12 mergers that, if you look at the housing markets well-defined spatially, should have been challenged by any regulatory agency. They would have been challenged in other sectors. My belief and my understanding is that what they're doing is they're defining, in some cases, whole regions of the United States. In one case that I could find, the whole U.S. as a single housing market. I think that is wrong. We, as
they should talk to the people in Jackson County.
Right.
Minnesota.
As potential homeowners, we're not substituting between the possibility of living in D.C. and living in L.A., right? So yeah.
So that was that last comment, then I'll turn it over to Senator Hirono, or Senator Lee for additional question, then Senator Hirono for a second round. But one of the things that has been troubling to me is in some of our rural areas where we have very steady employers. We really do. And whether it's the ag economy or whether it's a manufacturing, we have a lot of major companies. There's still issues with this housing, and there's just not enough builders, and the land is not as expensive. We don't have the land issue that Senator Lee was referring to in our state. And I can't help but think that in the old days there were just more smaller people that were coming in the home building industry, because we just can't get, I've done everything, and we've looked at what incentives can we have to bid them. These are usually maybe they're a mix of housing, right? They're starter homes, some of them are traditionally affordable, some are that next step up. And it's really hard, and it's hurting our rural employers because it's like chicken and egg. They want to expand. These are like manufacturing, but they can't really expand because they don't have the housing. And some of it is getting seniors to move into town, but then you need the condos. If they build them, they'll come, and then that frees up the single family. So thank you, Senator Lee.
Thank you. My next question is going to be both for Ms. Calder and Mr. Antoni. In your testimony, you both mentioned one way or another that the impact of government regulation, whether it be state, federal, or local, on housing prices. What government regulations do you think specifically cause the greatest increase in home prices? We'll start with you, Ms. Calder.
Well, I think there's a broad body of research on, again, state and local zoning regulations. Really, that's coming from the local level. And among those regulations, I think they all sort of add on, augment each other in ways where it's not totally easy to pull any one out and say, if you just fix this one thing, then you would fix housing affordability and housing supply. Because if you fix the one regulation, then the other regulations are all manipulatable, and they can also be made more restrictive in ways that won't allow for housing to be developed. That said, I think density regulations are really problematic. So where you sort of zone the whole city as single-family homes, that's going to be an issue because, of course, it limits housing. And I think aside from that, minimum lot sizes that are very large, those are going to be issues as well. And, just permitting processes that are very lengthy, very uncertain, and very open-ended, that doesn't give developers a lot of confidence as they're going through these processes and trying to make plans.
So it's the amalgamation of all of them, the combined effect of all of them, particularly some of those that you mentioned, like minimum lot sizes and things like that, end up creating an environment in which relatively few people can navigate this Byzantine labyrinth of regulations to be able to get it done. That in turn probably leads to more consolidation, which might help explain at least some of the answer to what Senator Klobuchar was talking about the fact that there aren't as many sort of smaller builders in many communities as there once were, because there's such an advantage that goes to a larger producer who has the experience and the extra resources to be able to devote to complying with those things. Mr. Antoni, do you have anything you want to add to that one?
Senator, I think another key thing that's important not to overlook here are regulations dealing with the financial sector. And the reason that has such an impact in the context of housing is because almost everyone who buys a house does so through financing. And so when we have regulations that force lenders to look at things essentially other than risk, what you are doing is you are divorcing the individual, the borrower, from their ability to repay a loan. And so from the lender's perspective, that builds losses into their business model. And as a consequence of that, they need to spread out those losses among all borrowers. In other words, it increases the cost of capital, it increases the cost of lending, and that trickles down into more expensive mortgages for everyone. One other thing that I think might be getting missed here, because so much of what we're focusing on, and rightly so, is the price of the home, but also what about what is in the home, things like appliances. We have all kinds of regulations, for example, that are aimed at increasing the efficiency of what it could be your refrigerator, it could be your dishwasher, your clothes washer, dryer, etc. And so many of these regulations that do increase appliance efficiency are actually a net loss for the consumer because of the increased cost. And when we're talking about these regulation-imposed cost increases, they tend to be completely missed because of hedonic adjustments in things like the CPI, so they're typically not included in inflation metrics. And actually a colleague of mine, Casey Mulligan, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, he has pointed out that the cost of regulations today are, on the average American family, are literally thousands of dollars more per year than they were just 4 years ago.
Yeah, that sort of thing adds up. Plus, a lot of the appliances just don't do as good of a job. But that's a conversation for a different day. But you're exactly right; those add up. And unlike our tax bill, where we can see at the end of the year how much we're paying, you can't see the regulatory compliance costs. There's no comprehensive bill for it. We have in our minds this idea that those are all paid for by corporations, and in a sense they are, but not really, because they get passed down to hardworking Americans who pay higher prices for goods and services, everything they buy, and they also pay for it in meaningful ways through diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment. What have you observed in your market analyses throughout the country? Are there factors that apply uniquely to metropolitan areas, more heavily populated areas? What do you see there in terms of home affordability, specifically in major metropolitan urban environments?
Well, what we find, Senator, typically is in those major metropolitan areas a higher level of regulation, and we also find higher taxes on average. And so we have higher costs of home ownership in those areas. On page 4 of my testimony, for example, you look at the most expensive areas in the country, almost all of them are in California in terms of owning a home. In fact, in several of those areas, the median income, it actually requires more than 100% of the median after-tax income to buy the median priced home in those areas. In other words, it's literally impossible for the typical American family to buy a home in those places. Conversely, as you start getting into typically more suburban or rural areas, and you typically see taxes and regulation go down, home ownership affordability on average does tend to rise.
And that in turn ends up creating even more disparities as you look across the economic spectrum. Because if you're in one of those areas, you're unfortunate enough to live in there, some of the, setting aside the graduated income tax system that we have, some of the benefits associated with home ownership, like the mortgage interest deduction, either phases out or ends at, I think, around $500,000 or something like that. So if you happen to be in one of those areas, even if you've got the cheapest home in your community, you might be priced out of it in multiple ways, and making it even harder for people who are just below the economic threshold of people who could otherwise purchase in that area. You may never get there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Senator Hirono.
Thank you. I just have a few follow-up questions and one new question. Professor Quintero, while there is a severe shortage of affordable housing in our cities, the new work-from-home dynamic means that there is often a glut of office space available. So some cities and developers are working together to convert underutilized office space to residential. For example, in Honolulu, you can now live in the office building that houses the federal bankruptcy court. Could relaxing or altering building codes and incentives to encourage office to residential conversions be part of the solution to our affordable housing crisis?
Anything that increases the effective supply of homes, whether it be new homes or existing, would help towards a solution. The case I'm most familiar with is Baltimore, where there's been a significant move towards conversions from commercial to residential. There's a significant barrier in terms, one structural, the other one in legal terms and zoning regulations that prevent these conversions from being done cheaply and quickly. And so I think there's a long way to go for conversions to actually solve the problem, but they would be a step in the right direction.
Well, to the extent that all these states and counties also have the zoning regulations, there may be a way for us to approach supporting these kinds of conversions with health and safety in mind, of course, on a national level. So if you have some ideas along those lines, please pass them on. But for Professor Stucke, in the multi-district litigation that has been filed against RealPage, one of the allegations was from someone who has utilized RealPage. He said that although we, meaning him, they are all technically competitors, RealPage helps us to work together to make us all more successful in our pricing. And so short of an agreement, that is definitely price fixing. And so based on the Supreme Court's current posture on price fixing, tacit collusion or conscious parallelism, these are not price fixing. So is this, now that we have these new tools or new entities such as RealPage with algorithms. This is not Bob giving you information. This is a whole system. Don't you think that we need to have some changes, as I mentioned, to our antitrust laws to address the new tools that are being utilized that basically results in fixed prices?
Absolutely. So antitrust needs to be modernized for the digital economy. The last time you've had meaningful antitrust regulation was update to legislation was over what is it, 50 years ago? And so but tacit collusion is very tricky to get at by itself because it can just be the response of market participants. Like you can have tacit collusion in markets where, one way to explain to my students tacit collusion is I say break up into groups of 2 or 3. Here's the monopoly price, here's the competitive price. Just show each other the price that you're going to charge for that day. And then after 10, 15 rounds, they report their results. Invariably, it's close to the monopoly rate. And so how, as an enforcer, can you get at that, right? I mean, you can't tell a competitor not to look at its rivals' rates. So getting at this collusion directly, head-on, is very difficult. So the best way to do it is to get at it indirectly. That would be through merger review, and then any sort of facilitating practices that can help achieve that algorithmic collusion. For example, sharing of confidential information with the hub.
I think we need to do something because there's just a lot of these new kind of tools, AI, all of these new tools that did not exist 50 years ago when the basic antitrust laws were first being articulated. And I do think that we need to, as you say, modernize. And if you have some language that you can propose to the committee, I would certainly be interested. But the fact that you have all these investor purchases now of housing stock, a huge percentage, it could be a huge percentage in certain areas like Atlanta, they seem to go to certain areas. I think that just increases the chances of these kinds of collusive, what I would call collusive parallel pricing. And I think we need to do, I'm asking you for some ideas on how we can go forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Hirono, for those good questions. And next up, we have Senator Blackburn. Then I have a very brief question, and then I think we're going to end things as there's a conflict with an AI meeting, but we are very focused on this issue right now. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you so much. And yes, you're right. It's a busy day. There is a lot happening. Professor Stucke, welcome. We're delighted that you are here from UT and appreciate that you would make the trip. So thank you for that. Ms. Calder, let me come to you. You know, in Tennessee, we have a lot of people that are moving there, and they're wanting to leave other areas. We even have some Minnesotans that have come to Tennessee to
Especially
relocate.
in the winter.
That's exactly right. They like our weather a whole lot better. But we know that there's a need to focus on some common sense solutions, and some of us have really done that. What we have found is over 10 million families spend more than half of their income on housing, and of course this makes it very difficult for the rest of their budget. So some of us at Finance Committee have brought forward a bill, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which would expand and strengthen the low-income housing tax credit. And that bill would increase the number of credits available to states by 50%. And it would improve that program so that it's better serving veterans, individuals in rural areas like we have in Tennessee, and victims of domestic violence. So I'd like for you to talk a minute about why it is so important to modernize that low-income tax credit.
Well, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. I certainly have written critically of the low-income housing tax credit in the past, and so I'm not familiar with all the details of this particular bill. But I do think that the low-income housing tax credit certainly needs modernizing, changing. Some of the issues that I see with the low-income housing tax credit in general right now are that, for one thing, it is more expensive than various demand-side vouchers or demand-side assistance. Most of the benefits also, at the present time, they flow to developers, is what research suggests, rather than flowing to low-income tenants, which is something that worries me because, of course, we have limited resources and we need to allocate those resources accordingly to low-income tenants wherever possible, and extremely low-income tenants first and foremost. And I've also seen that because it's a production side subsidy, research finds the program contributes to greater concentrations of poverty and racial minorities, and that's kind of something that's similar among production side housing subsidies. So again, not familiar with all the details, but certainly like the idea of improving the low-income housing tax credit.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Blackburn, can I add on to that?
Yes, you may.
We support your legislation and appreciate your leadership in pushing it forward. The low-income housing tax credit program is an important tool to develop affordable housing across the country and can be further improved, as your legislation would do. And we especially appreciate the provisions in the legislation that would allow for developers to ensure that these low-income housing tax credit properties are more affordable to the people who need it the most, the lowest income people, people in rural and tribal communities, and we appreciate the additional transparency around
let me
LIHTC
stay with
data.
you. We hear a lot about Bidenomics and the inflation rate that is out there, and the fact that the home price, the average home price, median home price is up over 27%. Mortgage rates have increased twofold since 2020, and homeownership is a part of the American dream. So many people want to own their own home. And this administration seems to have some misguided policies that are making that more difficult. So as you all are doing your work, Ms. Yentel, do you see Bidenomics, the inflation rate, all of that having a negative impact?
No, I'd say the opposite, actually. The low-income renters certainly are struggling to afford their rent, now in some cases more than ever. And housing affordability for the lowest income renters has worsened recently, but it has been a long-standing systemic issue in our housing market.
Well, my time's running out, but I would say Gallup disagrees with you. They found 21% of Americans believe it's a good time to purchase a home, and that number is way down from what it has been. That's the lowest that has ever been recorded, and inflation is having a negative impact. I've got two more questions for Ms. Yentel, but I know time has run out, and I will yield my time.
Okay, and you could put those on the record, is that all right? Okay, thank you. One last question. Ms. Yentel, another factor of many discussed today that disrupts healthy competition in the housing market is the prevalence of private equity-backed institutional investors buying up large swaths of single-family homes. In some neighborhoods, these types of investors own an incredibly high percentage of homes. I've seen this, like there's been major news reports on this, well documented. Can you talk about how institutional investors came to own a significant share of single-family homes in certain markets and how it affects housing affordability?
Well, especially on the second point, I would focus on the data that shows that institutional investors tend to be among the worst landlords. So there's clear evidence that institutional investors are more likely to be serial eviction filers, to file evictions more often, to add predatory fees, to use serial evictions and predatory fees as a profit-generating scheme. So as those institutional investors especially are targeting communities that are disproportionately people of color or have disproportionately high rates of poverty, then we're seeing the harm of these practices fall even greater on people with the lowest incomes and the most marginalized households.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Can I ask one very brief follow-up?
Yes.
I just want to give EJ a chance to respond to Senator Blackburn's question about Bidenomics and what impact it's had on housing affordability.
Certainly, Senator. Just very briefly, if you look at the performance of wages versus price indexes, such as the Consumer Price Index, you find that for a record 26 consecutive months of the Biden administration, the Consumer Price Index had larger annual gains than weekly earnings did. And so as a result of that, the typical American family has lost thousands of dollars in income, not in terms of the size of the paycheck, but what that paycheck can actually buy. And then you couple, as you pointed out, this connection between spending and inflation and the creation of money. When you also include the fact that interest rates have gone up so dramatically, that has increased the borrowing costs for families by thousands of dollars a year. And these effects combined make the typical American family about $7,300 poorer today as compared to January of 2021. In other words, take what the typical American family was earning at the time of the start of this administration and compare that to today, and it is as if you took $7,300 off of their annual earnings.
Anyone want to add anything more here? Are we good? Okay, Ms. Yentel.
Well, just to finish what I was saying with Senator Blackburn is that, to their credit, despite housing affordability worsening for the lowest income renters, to their credit, the Biden administration and this Congress provided historic resources during the pandemic that staved off what could have been an eviction tsunami. And instead, those resources kept eviction filing rates at their lowest on record. And those are the kind of investments and programs that should be continued and made permanent.
Okay, very good. I want to thank all of you. It's been a very informative hearing. There are so many issues that are clearly related when you have housing prices go up, in part because some of the factors we discussed here today, and then people go over and rent, they can't own their own home, and then those rents go up. You can kind of see what's been going on here. And I do think looking at this in a way that doesn't argue that the only thing at issue by any means is competition policy and algorithms, but it is part of it. And especially when you look at some of the recent changes and you think about, let's look at all the factors going on here with consolidation, with algorithms. I think it's actually a fodder for future work. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. I know that the record will remain open for the next week for senators to submit any additional questions. And with that, I want to thank you all for coming, and the hearing is adjourned.